Susan David.
Thank you.
Yes, who's been my pal for a long time. We're interested in so many of the same issues.
Absolutely.
And she is here to talk about her fantastic new book called Emotional Agility. I know you're seeing it reversed, but just imagine that you see it in a mirror so that you can see it properly. But as we get started with the conversation, please say hello in the comments. Tell me where you are, because as always, I get such a kick out of seeing where people are watching from. And also, Susan has been nice enough to say that she's going to give away 3 copies of her book, Emotional Agility, which we're going to hear all about. But if you want to be eligible to win in the U.S. and Canada, answer this question. When it comes to emotions, are you more of a bottler of emotion or a brooder of emotions? And so, Susan, before we get into like the big picture of emotional agility, just tell us what it means to be a bottler or a brooder.
Sure. So a bottler of emotion is someone who tends to push emotion aside. So they might say, well, I'm really angry with my boss, or I'm really upset with my wife or my husband, but I'm just not going to think about it. I've got this project to do.
Right.
I've got so much to get on with. At least I've got a job. So a bottler is someone who pushes emotion aside and has a tendency to do that. A brooder is someone who, on the other hand, tends to dwell in emotion. Why am I feeling what I'm feeling? This is terrible. Why did this happen? Why did my boss do this?
Oh.
And interestingly, people can also co-brood. Co-brooding is when you go out with your best friend and you have a big fat moan about your mother-in-law. But the defining feature of brooding is that you're stuck in emotion. You're not moving on from it. You're not getting any insight from it. You're basically stuck.
So while people think it's healthy to like express emotions, it's sort of like it's only if it's constructive, where you're saying if you're just like ruminating over it, it's not, it's sort of a dead end.
Correct. So what's interesting is that even though bottling and brooding look so different, bottling is pushing emotion aside, brooding is getting stuck in it, there's now a body of research that shows that when people have this tendency, time and time again, to bottle or brood, they have very similar outcomes. And the outcomes are not that great. So there's more of a likelihood that people will have low levels of happiness, low levels of well-being, high levels of depression, high levels of anxiety, and of course, you've got an issue that you are upset about and you're not solving it.
Right.
So bottling and brooding might feel constructive, but actually doesn't help us
in the long run.
Yeah.
So again, answer in the comments, U.S. and Canada, are you, and even if you're not in the U.S. and Canada, we can't send you a free copy, but would love to hear, are you a bottler or a brooder? And I think people can be one in one context and one in another.
People tend to have a tendency, one in one context, so people tend to have a tendency, but they can also flip. So sometimes someone might be, I'm dwelling and dwelling and dwelling. Oh my goodness, why am I getting so caught up in this? I don't want to think about it again.
Right. So they can switch.
They go from one to the other.
But so then it sounds like so it sounds like one of the big things about emotional agility is to try to help people get out of this bottling or brooding cycle and really deal with emotions in a more constructive, forthright way, instead of just like these ways that are not leading to good outcomes. So what is emotional agility?
Yeah, so a little bit of background.
Yeah. Oh, right, I know. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. I know Susan so well. I forgot to introduce her. Okay, yes. Back up, Susan. Other than just a person sitting in my living room, who are you? Sorry about that. Yes.
So by way of background, I grew up in South Africa and have been living in the US for over 10 years now. And I, by way of background, am a psychologist and an emotions researcher. So I did my Ph.D. and my postdoctorate at Yale University on emotions. And really when I was writing Emotional Agility, one of the core questions that I was asking is, what does it take internally in the way we deal with our thoughts? I'm not good enough. This is not okay.
Right.
Our emotions, feeling stressed, feeling angry, feeling anxious, and the stories that we tell ourselves. I'm not cut out for this career, even though I would love to. No one's ever around for me when I really need them.
Right.
And how these...
You've never supported me.
You've never supported me. And what I really was interested in is there's so much in the world that tells us how to be disciplined, how to be productive. But what I found in my research is fundamentally how we deal with our inner world, our thoughts, our emotions, our stories, can drive everything It drives what job we apply for. It drives
Yes,
how
yes.
we parent. It
Yeah.
it relates to our relationships. So this is the key question. And
Yeah.
I continue my work. I'm a psychologist at Harvard Medical School, but really wrote this book to answer this question. What does it take internally
Right.
to help us thrive in the world?
To understand how to use our emotions. Well, it's funny because when my husband became this boss of a bunch of people, he said to me, "I can't believe how much time I spend just talking to people about their feelings." And if you met my husband, you'd be like, "Yeah, I don't see him as being the guy you would be your first go-to person." But he actually spends a huge amount of time, because it turns out if you're managing people, helping them managing an emotional state, just like a parent, anytime there's a relationship, it's a big thing.
It's critical.
So what is sort of the highlight of the argument about emotional agility? I know deep at the heart of it, one is self-knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the core aspects of this book is really talking about how we grow up in a society and how we live in a society that tells us that happiness should be a goal. Which is different from what you talk about, where you're saying, how do we find ways to being happy? Often in society, we're told that, happiness trumps everything. And while, believe me, I'm not anti-happiness.
Right.
You have written books on happiness.
I know.
I wrote an end-to-end book called the Oxford Handbook of Happiness, which is what do we know about human happiness.
Yeah.
So I'm a very happy person,
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
love being happy. But what's interesting is that when people have this overarching goal of, I want to be happy, what's really fascinating is the research shows that they are more likely to push aside difficult emotions.
Oh, right. Because they feel like they shouldn't be feeling that.
I shouldn't feel angry. I shouldn't feel upset. I shouldn't. So some core ideas in emotional agility are, number one, to show up to your emotions. So instead of arguing with yourself as to whether you should or shouldn't feel a particular thing, you open your heart willingly to the experience of all emotions as containing potential data. So emotions are data, not directions.
Yes.
So there are values that are beneath those emotions, and how can we open ourselves to them?
No, and I'm so glad to hear you say that, because one of the things people often assume that I'm arguing is that people should be, that the goal is to be 100% happy 100% of the time, and that negative emotions are bad. And in fact, negative emotions are super helpful because they often will shine a spotlight on something like feeling envy, feeling regret, feeling guilt, feeling angry. Like, these can be very, very helpful. But you have to recognize that you're feeling it. And one of the things you talk about is like mislabeling, where somebody's like, instead of saying, my feelings are hurt, they're like, I'm mad at you. And then it's like, that's not helpful because you don't have a clear sense.
Yes. One of the things I talk about is this idea that, number one, underneath our emotions are often signals to things that we value. I've never met someone who's depressed who at some level isn't concerned about, how do I better be in the world?
Yes.
Someone with social anxiety, how do I belong better?
Yeah.
Someone who's upset with my idea was stolen at work, issues of equity and fairness, and so on.
Yeah.
So beneath our emotions are often signs to things that we value.
Yes.
And if we push those aside, then we don't enter into a space where we can set goals and shape our direction effectively. But absolutely, one of the aspects that I talk about in emotional agility is that often what we do is we use very broad brushstrokes for emotions. I'm angry. I'm mad. I'm mad. I'm sad. Or even the most common one is I'm stressed.
Yes.
So someone who comes home from work and says,
Yes.
I'm stressed. How was your day today? I'm stressed. And the next day, I'm stressed.
Yes.
There is a world of difference between being stressed versus disappointed, stressed versus angry, stressed versus betrayed, etc.
Yes.
So imagine if I was working with someone as an executive coach and the person said, I'm stressed, and I just took that on face value.
Right.
I might say, well, learn how to delegate more.
Yes.
But what if what's really underpinning it is I thought that my career would have been different.
Right.
And that my legacy would have been greater. It's a different conversation.
Yes.
So what's fascinating is that when people are able to take what feels like a big emotion and say to themselves, what are two other options?
Right.
What else might I be feeling here?
Right.
It takes this big, dark, difficult thing and helps to firstly generate a sense of real understanding, and secondly actually starts to activate the readiness potential in our brains so that we can start setting goals and acting around that particular thing.
Right. So if you're just joining, I'm talking to Susan David, who is this brilliant writer and researcher on the subject of emotion. We're talking about her new book, Emotional Agility. And if you want to have the opportunity to win a free copy in the U.S. and Canada, answer the question: when you are dealing with emotions, do you tend to bottle it up more, or do you tend to brood on it more? And it turns out they look very different, but in the end, they kind of get you to the same place. And so the book Emotional Agility is one of the things, is to how to be more emotionally agile. So Amanda, we have a brooder. Jess, bottler. Mandy, bottler. Chris, bottler. Neil in the UK, brooder. Mary says both, depending on the situation. That's interesting. Susan says, bought the book. Good. Thank you, Susan. Gold star for you. I'm a brooder. It's interesting. I wonder if brooders are more likely to buy the book because they're more in touch with the idea that they want to manage their emotions more. And brooders might not recognize.
Possibly.
That's kind of interesting. Leora says, I'm a brooder. It takes my husband to snap me out of the brooding and to tell me not to let emotions hamper my productivity. Ooh, that sounds like a bottler coming into conflict with a brooder. It doesn't always work because sometimes I'm in the heat of the moment and I feel like he is not entertaining my emotions, so I need better ways to handle my emotions on my own without it coming to our marriage. Now, I think Leora is like, so yes, this is something I think a lot of people are like, I'm trying to explain my emotions. You think I should just like focus on getting things done. Like, what would you say to Leora or somebody who's been in a similar situation about like how to have a conversation about managing the emotions?
So one of the things that Leora is talking about in the question that I think taps into some of the essence here is Leora saying, I almost need to have strategies myself before someone is coming to me and saying, snap out of it, snap out of it.
So don't go to somebody with your luggage. You've got to have your own plan.
We need, and this is why partly I wrote the book. You know, what is the skill set that's so important to us? So a couple of things is, I would say, first is this critical importance to show up to your emotions. So if you find yourself getting into a stage where you like, oh, you know, I'm mad, and you're starting to tell stories about why you're so mad, and, you know, because
he
no one's ever with me.
My boss never gives me credit. He never puts me forward. He doesn't suggest that I'm the one who gives the presentation.
Correct.
He overlooks me. Yeah.
And so what starts to happen, and what I talk about in the book, is how we get hooked by these emotions. So we'll say something like, I'm upset, so I'm just not going to take his call, or I'm really frustrated, so I'm just going to shut down. And so a core sign that you are hooked is when your emotions and thoughts are calling the shots, rather than your values, who you want to be in your relationship. So a couple of things that I would say, Leora, is number one, don't punish yourself for being a brooder. It's really important to be compassionate and to just notice those emotions in yourself. This is a critical aspect of how we can be kind. So you're not going to a stage where you're saying, oh, I'm thinking too much and this is terrible.
Right.
But rather...
Right. It's not that he's right and I'm wrong about the way I'm dealing with this. Yeah.
So open your heart up to those emotions. Try to...
and quickly go back to somebody who just joined. Bottling and brooding, just like remind people what that means.
Bottling, I push emotions aside, often in the service of some other goal, some other project.
Well, and it sounds like her husband, he said it's interfering with your productivity. So that sounds like bottling strategy. Yeah. It needs to be shoved aside so that you can get on with it. Yeah.
Brooding is getting so stuck in the emotion that I can't move forward. So a couple of key strategies that I talk about in the book is firstly, trying to label your emotion. When people are brooding, they tend to get so stuck in their playing and overplaying of the experience that they forget to actually say, what is it that I'm really experiencing in a nuanced way?
Right.
So you might be saying, I'm sad. What are two other things that might be going on for you?
Right.
Are you, disappointed? Are you feeling betrayed?
Yeah,
what else is really happening?
I feel lonely. I feel isolated.
Yeah.
I feel like left behind. I feel like everyone else is succeeding and I'm not.
Yes.
I feel ignorant. I feel,
So that's really important. Another aspect of trying to move yourself out of brooding is simply noticing your emotions for what they are. They do contain data, but they are not directions. Mm-hmm. So who's in charge here, the thinker or the thought? Who's in charge, this one emotion, or me, the person who is big enough to experience many emotions? Who's in charge, this one story of this isn't okay or things are unfair, or me, the person who is actually big enough and capable enough to contain all of my stories. So one strategy that is very practical is when you start saying to yourself, I am stressed, I am angry, I am upset, what you are doing is you are identifying 100% of yourself, I am, as stressed. If instead you simply did this, I'm noticing that I'm feeling stressed. I'm noticing that I'm feeling angry. I'm noticing the urge to leave the room every time my husband starts in on the finances.
Right.
What you're doing is you're starting to create a healthy distance between you and your emotion.
Right. You aren't, a little detachment.
Yeah, you aren't bottling, you're not pushing them aside, but what you are doing is you're starting to notice your emotions, thoughts, urges for what they are.
Right. No, and I'd be curious to know, people weigh in the comments, like, have you ever struggled to identify an emotion, like you're feeling bad and you don't even really know why you're feeling bad or what you're feeling? Do you have like a go-to thing? Like, I feel like so many people do say they're stressed, like, and that tells you nothing. I agree, because like what I always say sort of from the Happiness Project is I'm like, are you stressed because you're exhausted because you stayed up late watching Game of Thrones? Are you stressed because your best friend doesn't work with you anymore and so now you feel lonely? Are you stressed because your commute is terrible? Are you stressed because you have a bad boss and you have a lot of conflict? Are you stressed because nobody cleans up the office kitchen? Are you stressed because you need to go through this training and you feel like you're not good at that kind of software? Like, there's a million reasons, but if you don't know what it is, if it's just like, oh, I'm just throwing up my hands, then like you say, there's no direction there. There's no it's not specific enough to have that valuable information.
Yes.
Or like, I really hate that coworker, but if you're like, really, I'm jealous of my coworker because she goes on all these cool trips. Well, then it's like, okay, well,
that's what it is.
That's what it is, and that tells you something about yourself. So I'd be curious to know from viewers, like, have you had this, like, where there's an emotion that you struggle to name, or you've been overwhelmed by it? Like, somebody was telling me that she was at work and she's like, I was feeling really angry, and then all of a sudden I just started crying, and I was like, ooh, I think you need to dive into that a little bit more. Like, she seemed to have no awareness of, like, what was she actually thinking or feeling or what was driving, and then you feel sort of out of control of yourself, and that is not emotionally agile. That's emotionally at sea.
Inagile.
Yeah.
So interestingly, one thing that bottlers, as opposed to brooders, often find is that.
Yeah.
So what they do is they push the emotion, and then it upsurges. And in psychology, we call this amplification. So this is the idea that psychologically, when people try to push thoughts and emotions aside, we've all experienced this. Imagine you are trying to diet, and you say, I refuse to think about chocolate.
Yeah.
What do? You start dreaming about it. I'm dreaming about chocolate. So when people start pushing emotions aside, there's this effect called amplification. And amplification is basically this idea that the emotions or those thoughts come back even stronger.
Right.
So often when people bottle, they push the
They're
emotion
damming
aside.
it up, and it's creating this energy.
They think it's being productive, but actually it's the opposite.
Well, I wonder if you were working with somebody, or there was somebody in your family where there seemed to be these unpredictable eruptions. Maybe that's a sign of a brooder.
Yep. Yeah. No, it absolutely is.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
interesting.
It absolutely is.
And so Joanna is saying, is brooding like ruminating?
Yes. So brooding is absolutely like ruminating. And again, there's this idea of co-brooding, where you co-ruminate. Like, you go out with a friend and you say, I'm so angry with my husband, or I'm so angry with my mother. And what's the defining feature here is that you're not moving to any sense of insight, or this is what I'm going to do about it. You're just getting stuck in the emotion. What's fascinating is you'll leave that conversation thinking, oh, I love my friend. She just gets me.
Yeah.
But you go back to your mother-in-law, your husband, with worse behavior.
Okay, so what if you're the person who is you're experiencing the brooding? What are some constructive ways? Do you try to help them, lead them to those more nuanced vocabulary terms, or try to help them? How do you engage with that kind of person in a helpful way?
So firstly, this idea of labeling is just critical. What is it that's actually, going on here?
Right. And I just want to interrupt, because my favorite parenting book, but it works just as well for adults, is a book called How to Talk So Kids Will Listen and Listen So Kids Will Talk. It's like right there behind me. I love this book. And one of the things they say is, like, if you just tell people what you think they're feeling, a lot of times you get it wrong. Like, you say, that must have been a big relief. No, I was really annoyed. Or like, and so sometimes just like, even if you don't get it right, it's helpful because it helps people get in touch with what they're feeling.
They're moving to a point of clarity. They're
clarity,
moving to
clarity.
that point
You
of
want
clarity, which is really important. Another thing that I talk about in the book, and if I was with someone who was brooding or even bottling, is this idea that, you know, values are often seen as being cheesy or abstract.
Yes, light, fluffy, the soft stuff.
Or they're on walls in businesses, and we, you know, just think that they have no capacity to be effective in our lives. But values are freeing. When you create habits that are values aligned, it's freeing. When you start to help people to think about as a friend, as a colleague, who is it that you want to be in this situation?
Right.
Not is it how do you want to react, but who is it you want to be is so important.
I had a situation like that with my sister, and we were talking about a conflict that she was having at work, because she's a TV writer, so she has all kinds of conflicts all the time. This was a couple years ago, and I remember saying to her, like, well, this is really, you're going to do that, because she was talking about different courses of action, and she was doing something that I kind of thought wasn't necessarily the best course of action, and then I finally realized, I said, but to you, loyalty is so important. You would never do anything that could be perceived as disloyal. And she was like, yes, for me, loyalty is so important. And I was like, it's interesting, because it is a value, and it's a value that people, like, sort of, people have their own ideas of, like, how to balance things out. For me, it's equity. It was like, it doesn't seem fair, but it's loyal. You know what I mean? So it was, I could feel that we were having this different, that we were bringing different values to something where she had to decide how to behave. And so it's just interesting, because you sort of assume everybody feels the way you do, but they don't.
They don't. And it can be so freeing. You know, if I'm working, let me think of a workplace example. If I'm working with a leader who needs to have a difficult conversation, so needs to give someone feedback, but is avoiding or even bottling around it. I just can't go there. It's difficult. Ultimately, what they're doing is their thoughts and their emotions are still calling the shots. You know, they're still pushing things aside.
In the negative.
In the opposite way. So, you know, when you start doing that, you start getting into a situation where, you know, again, who's in charge here, the thinker or the thought? And in this case, the thought is in charge. But if you are able to start connecting with that leader and say, who is it that you want to be in the situation? What is important to you? And the leader says, well, you know, fairness is really important. You can then start having a really amazing conversation about how fair is it if you don't have the conversation with this employee, and they found out 6 months later that they've been doing something wrong. How fair is it to the rest of the team if you don't have the conversation? How fair is it to you? So what you're starting to do is you're starting to bring the lens of intentionality and our heartbeat, like the heartbeat of our own why, the heartbeat of who we want to be in the world, to the situations that we face. And, you know, in a world of complexity and chaos and difficulty, we've got to have some sense of who we are and what we bring to the world. And that is freeing, and it's healthy, and it protects us. It helps us to be resilient. It helps us to chart a course that is important to us.
And if you're just joining us, I'm talking to Susan David about her amazing book, Emotional Agility. And I want to, because I do love a quiz, a personality quiz, I have to give a shout out to your amazing quiz, which is very short, but it packs a lot of information. So we'll put the link to that in the comments if you want to take the Emotional Agility quiz.
Just by the way, that quiz, if people take it, it's about 5 minutes. And from it, what you get is you get a 10-page customized report, actually, on different aspects of your emotional agility. So it's fairly substantive, and a lot of people have found it
even though
really
it doesn't take you that long to take it, it actually can give you a lot of information. I mean, people love quizzes. And if you want to take my 4 tendencies quiz, you can take my quiz. I'll put a link to that, too. I love quizzes. But one of the things that was reminding me about my 4 tendencies is, because in my 4 tendencies, one of the things I realized is that people really do have different values. Like, as an upholder, and I don't know if there's upholders watching, for us, spontaneity is not a high value, but for rebels, spontaneity is a very, very high value. And if you're talking to a questioner, the idea that something's arbitrary, to them, they're like, I'm out. If it's arbitrary, like, I don't want to do that. And other people are like, they're not as keyed into that. And so it really helps when you think, well, people might be bringing a different perspective that's just as legitimate as mine, or like as upholders, self-command is an enormously high value. And then other people think that we're rigid. And we're like, no, this is great. This is just like me showing self-command.
Yeah.
And then other people are like, no, you're not flexible. And it's like, okay, flexibility is a value.
Yes.
You might value flexibility more than I do. And that's, again, it's like not that one person's right and one person's wrong,
Yeah.
but how do we talk about these things in a way where we can just deal with each other without just getting all worked up? And,
yes.
Yeah.
And being able to recognize, and one of the things that I talk about in emotional agility is this idea of, showing up to emotions, but then also being able to step out of them and be able to perspective take and recognize other people's views. But, you make me think of something in particular, which is there's these ideas of values that might seem in conflict in the world, but sometimes people say to me, what if my own values are in conflict?
Yes.
What if I...
That happens a lot.
What if I value work, but I also value family?
Yeah.
And actually, one of the things that I talk about in emotional agility is, firstly, the idea that we can actually evolve our own set of values is the most remarkable capacity of human beings. So there's this ability to choose yourself that is just so amazing. But one of the things that I talk about in emotional agility is often people say, I've got values in conflict. But if we take that apart, often it's not the values that are in conflict. I often think of values as being facets of a diamond.
Right.
So I've got all of these different facets, and sometimes some facets are facing me more front and center, and sometimes they're turned away. So I can value career and I can value home, but those things aren't always facing me in the same way. What's most often in conflict are not values. What's most often in conflict are goals. I have a goal that I want to be at my child's practice, and I have a goal that I want to finish this project. So it's most often actually our goals. That we are mortals and we can't be in two places at once.
Right.
It's the goals very often that are in conflict, not the values.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, in Better Than Before, I talk about the strategy of clarity, and it is all about getting clarity on this idea of like what are you really pursuing? And again, if you're in the U.S. or Canada and you want to potentially win a free copy, we're giving away 3 copies of Emotional Agility. Answer the question in the comments: are you a brooder or a bottler? I love that pairing of things.
Don't we look like sisters?
We do, and we're both wearing purple. And you can't see it, but my living room is purple, so we're like incredibly well coordinated.
I'm just going, oh my goodness.
Yes. And so one of the things that you talk about, which I think is really helpful too, is sometimes this stuff can feel very big and abstract, but one of the things you like to talk about is tiny tweaks and how people can like take steps in their everyday life that just like they can get kind of a quick fix of this is big, deep, important stuff.
Yes.
Like what are some of the little things people can do?
Absolutely. So I talk about lots of just incredibly important small changes.
Yes.
Often when we think about change, we think of,
Yeah,
I've got to give up my job, or I've got to
yeah,
completely change
yes.
careers, or I've got to move to a vineyard in Italy.
A 3-week silent meditation retreat.
Yes. But actually, what we know is that so much of people's well-being and effectiveness and happiness comes through tiny tweaks.
Yeah.
The small changes that we make in our lives that are values aligned.
Yeah.
So an example for me
Yeah.
is I have been incredibly busy writing this book.
Because your book's coming out right
My
now.
book's coming out. I've got an 8-year-old. I've got a 3-year-old. I, don't have a lot of family support in Boston because I'm from South Africa. And yet learning is really important to me. And one of the things that I'd recognized is that for ages, even though I love reading, I had not read outside of my area. So I have started to listen to audiobooks. Now, it sounds like such a small, tiny tweak, but I cannot describe the difference that it makes to my day to feel like I've engaged in that part of me that's really important.
So I wonder,
that's an example.
So if anybody, let's keep talking about this, but if anybody has any great tiny tweaks, this is a great thing, like put it out there, because maybe your tiny, like this is one where I can imagine that a lot of people would be like, hey, yeah, I could totally do that. Like, it's sometimes we can really learn from each other. So put it in the comments because it would be great.
Love to.
Or like even things that are like classic tweaks, but then you finally do them and you're like, oh, now I get what the big deal is. It's like always put your keys away in the same place. Like, how many times have you read that piece of information? And then you're like, But you know what? When you put your keys away in the same place, it's like revolutionizes your life.
So I've got one that I want to add to that
Oh,
you've just reminded me of. Being a present parent is really important to me.
Yes.
Again, during this book launch, I have been finding that I've been moving into worse habits, which is, for example, being on my phone a lot and even bringing the phone to the table, which in our, we have this rule, but I've been starting to do it. So one of the things that I started to do is, I talk about this actually in Emotional Agility, is I've got a habit of already putting my keys in the drawer.
Yeah.
So now what I do is I piggyback a new habit onto that existing habit. So what I've been doing for a while now is I put my keys in the drawer and I add my cell phone automatically into that same drawer.
Right.
So I've got this piggybacked new habit that is values aligned.
Yeah.
So that's another tiny tweak, but makes such a difference.
Right. Now so Sarah says her tiny tweak is asking my husband outright when I need something instead of expecting him to notice. Well, I think that's really good because it's very easy not to notice things that other people think are perfectly obvious that need to be done. And sometimes when you just say, and again, I think this is probably goes to emotional agility. It's like sometimes people don't want to admit, like, I need you to do X, Y, Z, or like, my birthday's coming up, or something. Like sometimes it feels almost shameful to say that you need something.
Yes.
Or like one thing I realized that I need to do is, my husband is just not somebody who takes photos.
Yeah.
And so literally, like, sometimes I get requests from journalists and they're like, show me a picture of like you on vacation with your family. And I'm like, I literally do not appear in one photograph. And I'm like, I realize he just doesn't think about it.
Yeah.
And I need to say to him, like, hey, would you take a picture of me? So that I have some pictures of me being here. And but it feels embarrassing in a way. Because you're like, don't you want to take a picture? You feel like somebody should think of that. But I know him. He just isn't thinking about it. But it's an uncomfortable emotion.
Yeah, and if you were getting hooked into that, you might say...
He never remembers me.
He doesn't remember me. He's, I'm invisible to him.
Yeah, I mean, you can spin a whole...
And I talk about my own embarrassing examples in the book. I talk about a few of them.
It is embarrassing sometimes to admit your emotions. So I want to hear more people's tiny tweaks because I love a tiny tweak.
One that people have said that I think just really resonates with so many is, how when you've been in a relationship for, however many years, how there's these little things that you take for granted. So, for example, your 16-year-old son comes home from school and you, like, barely looking up from what you're doing, say, how was your day? Yeah. And your son barely looking up from what he's doing says, fine. Yes. Or you cooking and your wife comes in from work. And so what we do is we just continue the cooking and just say hello, over our shoulder.
Here, sorry, my dog. This is Barnaby. He's not supposed to be down here, but
that was a big tweak in your life.
Here's a cameo. Yeah, Barnaby. No, but you're using this term hooked. So what is it for people who weren't? Because this again, we're talking about emotional agility.
So let me just tiny tweak is that there might be these little things that we do that have become habits that are not values aligned. And if you can, construct a tiny tweak, which is when my spouse comes in from work, I always get up from what I'm doing. Look that person in the eye and greet them lovingly. That makes a huge difference.
That's one of the things I talk about in Happier at Home. And that is a tiny tweak. I'm here to attest. It makes a huge difference. And it's very easy, actually. I think people quickly get in the habit of giving each other like really tender, attentive hellos and goodbyes. But I think it's one of the most effective tiny tweaks that you can make because it really changes the atmosphere of your household when people really feel recognized and they really feel. So I think that's an amazing one. But back to this idea of hooked. So explain what this idea of hooked is. Being hooked by emotion. So
effectively, the idea of being hooked is that your thoughts, your emotions, your stories are driving you rather than your values. I always think about that very beautiful Viktor Frankl quote. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose.
Yes.
And it's in that choice that comes our growth and freedom. So often what we do is we don't create any space between our stimulus and response. My husband's starting to talk about something, I'm going to leave the room.
Right.
I feel like a fraud at work, so I may as well just keep quiet.
Yeah.
So what we do is our thoughts and emotions and stories are calling the shots.
and that's when you're hooked.
That's when you're hooked.
Because they're driving the ship instead of you driving the
Yeah.
ship. So I wonder if there's been a time when you felt hooked, when you felt like you were caught in an emotion and it was driving you, and you didn't. I mean, I think the thing that you talk about really is that space.
Yeah.
And that's like the hardest thing to create. Like if you don't, you're like, if I could remember to count to 10, I wouldn't be in this predicament. It's
Yeah.
like it's so hard when it just comes rushing so quickly.
Yeah.
So a lot of what you talk about is how do you create that possibility?
How do you create the possibility? And so much of that is by recognizing our patterns.
Yes.
Getting into a space with our emotions where so much of the doing of the pause happens before we actually even need to pause.
Yes.
So if we attuned to ourselves and attuned to our needs and attuned to things that drive us, we become so much more able then. If we even have a good sense of like, what is important to me in my relationships, that can be a steering action that helps us to create that pause.
Right.
So an example for me is I talk about in emotional agility how many years ago, and I go into this, very difficult experience that I had where a colleague had actually blatantly stolen an idea of mine. And I was so upset about it. And I called my husband and he said to him, like, you will never believe what's happened. And he's a physician. And he answered the phone and he said to me, I'm sorry, Susan, I can't talk now. I've got a patient lying on the table waiting for an emergency procedure. Plonk. Okay. And he put the phone down. And so my being hooked was the one time.
Yes.
The one time
yes,
I met him.
I hear it. You can feel it coming. And it feels so justified.
It feels so justified. And so, instead of having a reasonable conversation with my colleague, I spent 3 days in a snit at my guiltless husband, whose only crime was trying to save his patient's life, which is ridiculous. But
it makes complete sense.
Once I became clear on what is a value in my relationship that is really the crux of how I want to live that relationship. And for me, what I came to is the idea that I want what I call a clean relationship. A clean relationship is where there's no need to walk on eggshells, or there are conversations that we can't have because the other person's going to explode. So clean relationship is this clear way of communicating that just feels central to who we want to be with each other.
So there's no bottling and there's no
brooding.
There's
no bottling, there's no brooding. There's just this clearness and sense of how we want to be with one another. And once that became part of our conversation, it enables me so much more to not get hooked, to not be driven in those ways.
Well, and what's interesting is the listeners, everybody's talking about how that is the great challenge. Christian says meditation and yoga practice help create space. I think that's something a lot of people say. Michelle says, how do you open up and talk to someone who only cares about their own feelings, thoughts, and needs, that only listens to response and not to actually understanding what you're feeling? Well, that, again, it's like, how do you deal with, no matter how emotionally agile you might be, how do you deal with somebody who, maybe it sounds like it's a brooder, because we were talking about brooders and bottlers. Brooders were ruminating, and then the bottlers are pushing it aside. But somebody who only is talking about their own thoughts and feelings, and so then maybe can't even engage with your thoughts and feelings because they're so overwhelmed by their own emotional state that they can't enter into a
and this is an aspect of brooding, which is that people who brood so much of the airtime, even though you're doing it with great intentions, which is you trying to solve this issue that's
cathartic,
So one of the issues is that it doesn't actually create space for anyone else, for other people's feelings, and it can be very difficult in relationships. So one thing that I'd suggest is, there can often be in that kind of situation a situation where the person feels like, I'm seeing all of your feelings, but where are my feelings? How do I? And so what's really helpful is to enter into what is a shared goal here? What is a shared objective? Like, what is mutually important to us that we can both agree on? Because when you do that, you're moving away from the space of me versus you, and much more of how do we want to be with this together.
So you're super annoyed with our boss. You feel like he blah 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 blah, But so how can you and I together think about how we can create an office atmosphere where everybody feels like their contributions are valued or something like that?
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm going to enlist you, or
Yes.
we're going to work on something together.
Yes, this is something that it's not about a me versus you, but it's actually about how can we move to a space that feels okay for us.
And again, if you're just joining, I'm talking to Susan David, who's
hello.
Yes. Barnaby was just here. My dog just ran through. We're talking about her book, Emotional Agility, and we're giving away 3 copies of the book. And if you are in U.S. and Canada and want to possibly win a free copy, we're asking the question, are you more of a brooder or are you more of a bottler? And it sounds like people really get those terms. It seems like the listeners... here's a good tiny tweak. I love a tiny tweak. Sylvia says, upon starting the day, I turn on the radio as opposed to the TV so I can be more physically productive and still be entertained and informed. Oh, so this is like about... how you can, not just sort of sit and be mesmerized by the television, but you're actually getting dressed and everything, but you're still getting the information that you want. And
that's a great tiny tweak.
That's a great tiny tweak. And also, do you have any examples of when you've been hooked? Hooked being...
driven by thoughts and emotions. Your thoughts, your emotions are in charge.
Right.
Effectively.
Yeah. I think this is probably something where people might even be more aware of how other people are hooked than how they are hooked. Because I bet it's one of these things where, like, first of all, if you spot it, you got it probably. But also, like, you see how other people do it. When it's you, it feels so. You feel so justified. And of course, I'm going to be upset, totally preoccupied with this thing that happened. But when other people are doing it, you sort of have more. You're
They're key signs. They're key signs that our thoughts and emotions are driving us.
Okay,
and
what
stories.
Are the key signs?
So a couple. Number one, are you in busy mind? Busy mind is when you are starting to plan conversations of, I'm going to say such and such, and he's going to say this and that.
I do that. Rehearsing.
When you do that, you need to know that you are likely hooked.
That's not good.
The second is that we often, when we are hooked, we don't get hooked in new ways. We often get hooked in patterned ways. So you imagine you grew up in a family where it was very difficult to state your needs because your needs in that family were unseen. And so you might have learned that how you get by in that family is to make yourself invisible. That when I show up too much, when I make my needs known, I'm belittled or, So what can start happening is we can be in a situation where we've learned how to be, even from childhood, in ways that early on in our lives might have actually been functional, might have worked for us, might have helped us to find our path. But then we reach a stage later on in our lives where there's now a disconnect between my current life and the way that I'm living. So an example,
and is this an example where like people who have big drama and like have a kind of a big tantrum and that's the way they're used to people like addressing a thing. But then at a certain point, people are like, I don't want your drama. Like, it's like, we don't have time for this. And you're just seen as sort of like a needy, demanding person. But you can imagine probably at one point it worked great.
At one point it worked great. So absolutely, that's a great example. Another might be, that you've always held back in relationships because from a young age, that was what you were taught. And now you're struggling to reach a point of feeling intimacy and connection because you still have that sense barrier. So one of the signs of being hooked is that you have these patterned responses that come up. And a key question to ask yourself is, is this thing serving me? It might feel comfortable. It might feel what I've been doing for a gazillion years. But is this way of being serving me? And I saw, one of the listeners was saying something that she was asking herself when she was hooked. A key idea is saying, is this might be how I feel, but is this how I actually want to be? Another way we get hooked is when we get so focused on being right that we forget to again ask the question of, is this helping me? Is this actually helping me? We've all had that experience where you might have an argument with someone, maybe it's, a spouse or something, and you finally have calm descend on the family. And then something compels you one
Yes.
last time.
Yes, yes. Final last word.
You
We
know,
gotta get
to
it in.
say to
Yes.
the person
Yes.
why it is that you're right.
Yes.
In
Yeah.
so many aspects
Yes.
of our lives, leaders,
Yeah.
managers,
Yeah.
parents become so focused on being
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
that they forget to ask themselves, is this thing actually serving me?
Well, and I'll tell you where this comes up a lot, if you know the four tendencies, is this comes a lot with questioners. Because it maddens questioners when people are doing things that are inefficient or unjustified. They want to know the reasons for why. And I've heard from so many people where, as a questioner, they get fired, or they're seen as not team players, or they're seen as insubordinate because they're asking questions, and the person's like, well, you're not accepting my authority, you're not accepting my judgment. And so I think for a questioner, or like a manager, if you're managing questioners, is to realize that I feel like they're making a bad choice, but I've sort of explained to them that I think that they're making the wrong choice, and yet my boss is continuing to hire that firm, even though I think there's a better firm. But really, I need to say, in this situation, I've made my argument. For whatever reason, I am not being heard, but if I keep pushing it, I might really jeopardize the trust that my manager has in me, or the goodwill of my team, or and really think about, well, where is this going? Because just saying like, but you're all wrong and I'm right, like in the end, that it's like they may have considerations you don't know about, that you may not have the full picture.
Sometimes actually, along those lines, what I talk about is this idea that, imagine, and we all do this, sometimes we have arguments that we struggle to let go of, sometimes at work we struggle to let go of an opinion. Families can break up through this thing that this person did that was wrong to me, and I can't even remember what it was, but so sometimes the way that I think about this, and I talk about this a lot in Emotional Agility, is imagine if the gods of being right came down and said, you are right. Like, you are right.
Yes.
You still get to choose how you want to be.
Right.
Being right is well and good, but as individuals, we still get to choose how we want to react.
Right.
And sometimes what that means is that we need to let go.
Yeah.
We need to let go and hold lightly our opinions.
Right. Well, one thing I always say is, like, no matter what you think is most important or whatever, you can always choose to do something out of love for someone else. So, like, maybe you think it's ridiculous that, your family wants to get up at 8 a.m. and open Christmas presents, because you're like, why can't we just sleep till 10? There's no difference. But you can say, like, even though I think it's crazy to get up at 8 a.m. when we could all sleep late, it's like you can still choose to do it out of love. And again, it's like saying, like, I'm going to let another value sort of trump. Well, it's interesting because I'm back to this idea of bottling and brooding. And again, let us know in the comments if you're a bottler or a brooder. And we will, and then you'll be eligible to win a copy of Emotional Intelligence. But it looks like it's very common for people to be paired with the opposite. So Chris says, I'm a bottler and my husband is a brooder. Some things just don't get talked about. Lisa, I'm a brooder married to a bottler. Communication can be challenging. Jen, brooder married to a bottler. We're struggling with communication. So, so are there some sort of like quick things to keep in mind that you would say if you are, and I can imagine at work people might be paired that way too. Like if you're in a pair with somebody who has kind of the opposite coping, because they're both. You said they're both not constructive, but in kind of opposite ways.
So I think that the challenges for each and the tasks for each depend on who you are in that pair. If you are a bottler, bottlers tend not to as easily show up to other people's emotions.
Okay, they want you to bottle too.
They, I'm getting on with this, so you should be getting on with it as well. There's this beautiful phrase in South Africa where I grew up. There's this beautiful phrase, sawubona. And sawubona is a greeting that you hear on the streets every day. It's a Zulu greeting for hello. But what it really means is, I see you. I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being.
Right.
Isn't that beautiful? I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. So bottlers, often because they push their own emotions aside, they feel that everyone else should do the same.
Yes.
And what this can lead to is the other person not feeling seen.
Yes.
Effectively feeling invalidated. So a really important skill for bottlers to learn is to just show up. To be there to be connected and to create a space where that person can feel what they feel and even necessarily sometimes say what they feel.
Right.
There's fascinating research looking at this in children, that when children are really, really upset about something, if the parent bottles, if the parent says, don't worry about it, everything, let's push it aside.
You love parties. You always have fun at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Yeah.
That actually can exacerbate, it can make these emotions amplified. Whereas if the parent just shows up to the child, and it's, I'm by no means a paragon of virtue when it comes to this, but if the parent shows up to the child and helps the child to, seems like you're really feeling scared about going to this party, that what it does is there's this automatic de-escalation that happens. So for bottlers, showing up to emotions, creating a space for emotions is really, really important. For brooders, perspective taking is really important. This is how I feel. I'm noticing that I'm experiencing these emotions. What else might be going on here that might be a shared way that we can look at the situation? Because brooders are often so focused on their own story that they struggle to create, again, space for other people's stories.
But in your description, you can see how bottlers and brooders could kind of bring out the worst in each other, because a brooder's like, you're just reacting emotionally, you're not thinking this through, like, we're not making any progress here, let's just get on with our lives. And the brooder is saying, like, you never want to pay any attention to how anybody feels, it's not important to you. I mean, you can see how you could really quickly get into a cycle of, like, everybody polarizing each other. So it's like, I think that's why a book like this is really helpful, because since it sort of shows you how to think about a pattern in a way where you can see how you could intervene and break a cycle. Because, I mean, if folks are typical, it's pretty typical for people to be paired up with somebody has the different coping strategies.
And also for both people in that dyad, this idea, what you were talking about earlier, and that I speak about in emotional agility, of what is important here. Love is important here, or in my relationship, cleanness is important. What is important here? That allows us to have that as the overarching way we want to be.
Or trustworthiness. If you say you're going to do something, I need to be able to count on you. Well, so Eileen has a really good question on the bottling brooding. If bottling and brooding are sort of the two unhealthy ways, what's your term for, like, the healthier? Is that agile?
That's emotional agility. Absolutely.
And what do you say? What would you say is kind of the
key definition, if you like? So emotional agility is the ability to have any number of difficult thoughts, feelings, and stories.
So it's not that you're happy all the time.
No, because life is fragile, and life is often a struggle, and life doesn't go according to plan.
Right. And your colleague does.
Your colleague does irritate you. And so, what I'm talking about in emotional agility is really the idea that the world is not a perfect world, and we as human beings need to develop a skill set that enables us to navigate the world as it is, not as we want it to be, but as it is. So emotional agility is the ability to experience any number of difficult thoughts, feelings, and experiences, and still make choices and bring yourself forward in ways that are values aligned, connected, and intentional. And I talk about very key skill sets. I talk about showing up, being open to emotions. I talk about stepping out, how you create space in practical ways between yourself and your experiences, as well as the ability to perspective take in others. I talk about this idea
and these are the 4 steps, because in the book you sort of lay out, like, the 4, if you want to get this, it's, like, very clear what the 4 steps. So now the third step.
The third step is walking your why. The idea that we are, as humans, so often subject to social contagion. Someone gets upset, so we get upset. Someone's looking at their cell phone, we look at our cell phones. And yet, if we have a stronger sense of what our values are, there's this amazing body of research that's showing that values are not these arbitrary, bizarre things that are kind of cheesy and abstract, but really, the way I talk about it is that they are qualities of action. That today, you get to make a towards move or an away move from your values. If your value is something around health, you go to the cafeteria and you get to make a towards move where you're choosing something at that cafeteria that is values aligned, or you are moving away. So I think of values as qualities of everyday action that are just critical in helping us to be effective and agile. So the third step is this walking your why. And then the fourth is what I call tiny tweaks.
Right.
How do you make tiny tweaks to your habits, your motivation, and your mindset that ultimately help you to use your values and not be driven by your emotions and thoughts in very practical, everyday experiences? When you're under stress, when you're time poor, and so on. So great synergy between what you talk about as well.
Now, one of the things also that you have this great manifesto. I love a manifesto. Here's a manifesto, and it's full. It's so full of like information. We can't go through it. It would take a couple of hours for you to like really describe it. But like hit some of the key points.
Sure.
Because and I'll put a link. Elizabeth and I talked about manifestos at our live event, and I feel like a manifesto is a great way. Like if you're struggling with this, like coming up with your own manifesto is a really great way to get clarity of thought.
Yes.
And so what are some of the highlights?
Well,
and again, I just want to say, this is Susan David, my twinsy. Yes. We're talking about her book, Emotional Agility, which is about how to get unhooked from emotions, how to show up for your emotions. We're asking the question, are you more of a brooder or a bottler when it comes to emotions? And answer that in the comments and maybe get a free copy. And now Susan's going to talk about this really cool manifesto.
So let me choose a couple. I'll choose a couple.
I'm sure they're all your favorites.
They're all my favorites, but I'll choose a couple.
But is there one that like you feel like resonates with people that you talk to the most? Like where people are like, oh wow, now I get that?
4, actually.
Oh really? Okay, that's good.
I'm not gonna do,
it's a good manifesto.
I won't do 4.
It's a good manifesto.
So the first is, I talk about this, accept your full self, good and bad emotions, the whole package, with compassion, courage, and curiosity. Acceptance is a prerequisite for change. This is critical. We live in a world where we so often feel like we are in a never-ending Iron Man or Iron Woman competition. And that if you're compassionate towards yourself, if you're kind towards yourself, you must be kidding yourself, weak, lazy. It is the opposite.
It is,
People who create a safe space for themselves are more honest with themselves. They are more able to change effectively because they aren't self-punishing. They are able to be. So this is just so important, being kind to yourself and welcoming all of your emotions. There's no emotion that's wrong or right.
Right.
It doesn't mean you need to act on your emotions, but there's no emotion
it's like saying
that is
like,
wrong or right.
It's not like if I'm jealous because my sister like got this great new promotion, like that somehow that's shown, like that's so wrong of me. I should feel happy. I should feel happier for
Let
her.
go of that. Let go of it. Acceptance is a prerequisite to change.
That's good.
Here's one that people love. Think of areas in your life where you might have what I call dead people's goals.
Ooh, dead people's goals. Ooh, okay. I want to hear from listeners on this.
All right, dead people's goals. I don't want to be rejected. I don't want to fail. I never want to get anxious. I don't want to be disappointed.
Right.
I don't want to, not get the job.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Dead people are the only people who never get disappointed, who never get anxious, who never, get rejected, who never fail, but they're dead. So do we really want dead people to be our role models? And really what I'm talking about here is how if we open our hearts to the fullness of our human experience and our human emotions, we can incorporate that sometimes we will be disappointed.
Right.
But
you just have to accept that.
But that's what life is.
Yes, right.
That is the beauty of life.
Right.
And so, are there parts in your life, are there areas of your life where you have dead people's goals?
Right. Okay? Excellent. Okay.
All right. Another one. So often when people are going into difficult situations, they'll say things like, and this is actually very pervasive in our culture, is people say things like, conquer fear. Get rid of your fear. Do away with fear. Again, as an emotions researcher, fear is such an important emotion. It's a critical emotion. It helps us to navigate ourselves. It helps us to understand where we're experiencing threat. So what I talk about in emotional agility is this. Abandon the idea of being fearless. Instead, walk directly into your fears with your values as your guide towards what matters to you. This is what people love. And it speaks so much to me. Courage is not an absence of fear.
Right.
Courage is fear walking.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm meaning here is that courage is not about doing away with, trying not to be fearful.
Yes.
It's rather about noticing your fear compassionately and kindly and still choosing to walk in the direction of what is important
Like,
to you.
I am terrified at the thought that I'm going to get up in front of 30 people and give the presentation tomorrow, but I'm just acknowledging that it's like, you know, I feel afraid, but I'm going to really prepare, because then it's like the fear can help be constructive. I'm going to really prepare. I'm going to check my slides. I'm going to go to the room. I'm going to do all those things to try to, like, manage the fear and not sort of say, like, I shouldn't feel afraid.
Yeah,
it's no big deal.
And that doing that presentation might be a core part of who you want to be in your career, who you want to be as a leader. So it's towards what is critical to you. And last one is, I mean, there are a number here, but learn how to hear the heartbeat of your own why. Learn how to hear the heartbeat of your own why. That might sound really esoteric, but we so often live our lives in our heads.
Yes.
You know, intellectualizing, and we stop thinking even about what is truly important inside of me.
Yeah.
So an example here is that often people will have goals, but the goals are what I call have-to goals. They're goals that are driven by, a sense of shame or obligation.
My parents are expecting me to go to medical school.
Correct. My doctor's at me to lose weight.
Yes. I call those red herring habits.
You know, I feel shamed into doing it. So have two goals. What's so interesting is so many of us have two goals. And we even wrap ourselves up in have to language. I have to go to the meeting.
I have
to go to the meeting. I have to be on dad duty today.
Yeah.
What we know is that as soon as we have to do something, our brains want us to do the opposite. We often push and reject. So a want-to goal is a goal that is driven by an intrinsic sense of what's important to you. I want to lose weight because
I'll feel better.
I'll feel better, or I'll see my children grow up.
Yeah.
And what we know is that when we have want-to goals that are connected with, you know, truly what's important to us, those goals are more likely to be sustained over time. They're more likely to be effective. You know, when there's give and take, when there's stress, when there's time pressure.
Right.
So those are
No, so again, I'm talking to Susan David about her great book, Emotional Agility. But Eileen makes a point, which I think is, I would love to hear you talk about, is that it seems like a lot of people are brooding about the election. And I think it's a very emotional, turbulent time, just generally in the United States, because we just had the election. And so just to turn it into like kind of a how-to that might help people, if you're in a situation where you're in an environment where people really seem to be overwhelmed by emotion, is there a way to like navigate that?
Or you
feel overwhelmed where like it's really interfering with my ability to get my work done, or because you don't want to bottle it and just be like, it doesn't matter, I need to get on with things. But how do you acknowledge this emotion and in a way that's healthy for you and for other people too?
So again, I would say one thing that's just really important is labeling. Because so often when we're upset, we'll just be, it's ridiculous. And, you know, my husband actually has this verb for me. He says to me, not that I get indignant, but I indignate.
Oh, right.
You're indignating.
So that's funny.
If you're in brooding, you're often in this phase of like indignation. You know, that's often what. So important parts of it are, number one, labeling emotion. Number two, not saying that you shouldn't or should feel something, but being able to, I'm noticing that I'm getting angry. I'm noticing that I'm sad. I'm noticing. Try to find the values that are underneath those emotions. Is it that you're disappointed? Is it around issues of equity and fairness? Is it, you know, what is the value that's underneath that emotion? And then what are choices that you can make in your everyday life that are values aligned around this particular situation?
So in a way, you're taking something that is very distressing to you and trying to think like, well, how can I turn this to the good? Because it's going to make me all the more committed to my own values in my own life, because I'm trying to channel.
Yes.
Instead of getting hooked, where I can't. I'm trying to like actually use it
effectively. And what does that look like? What does it look like in your community? What
Yeah.
does it look like for you around your Thanksgiving table?
Yes,
What
right,
does it
yes,
actually
yes.
look like?
Yes.
So when you start getting
Yes.
into that frame, you're not doing away with the emotion, but you're using that emotion in a way that's just actually freeing. It's
Yes.
liberating. It's
But
important.
but I think you just mentioned the Thanksgiving table. I think that's another example of managing emotion. It's like, given how I feel and given my values and what's happening, and I'm going to be in a place with a lot of family members who may feel very differently, like, what is my value about this specific situation? Like, how do I, like, to think about it and to, instead of just, like, going and kind of, like, having unchanneled emotions that,
Yes.
like, everybody's dealing with, and you're sort of trying to say, okay, I'm going to look very closely at what's happening right here, right now, and, like, how do I want to steer things
Yeah.
so that I can, maybe my value is, I only see my family once a year, and so my value is we're not going to talk about it because I don't think that we're going to achieve anything, and it'll only disrupt our family. So maybe we're going to choose to focus on our favorite football team or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you can change. You don't. It's not like you're denying it.
Yeah.
But you're just saying, like, what is the value in this particular situation?
Yeah.
Right?
What is you know, when I see these people around, like, what is it that I feel that we have that is shared
Yes.
and important to us?
Well,
It's so important.
So it seems like that's the theme that's coming up, is this idea of, like, finding the common ground with somebody, and that can help emotions.
Just really, really important. And then another thing that I talk about in emotional agility that I think applies to Thanksgiving is not being caught off guard.
Yes.
You know, when
Yes.
you are, for example, more of a butler, you might say, well, I'm just not going to say anything.
Yes, yes.
But actually, what we
Ooh.
know is that there was this beautiful article called When the Imp in Your Brain Gets Out. And what this is you say, I'm not going to say something to my boss, I'm not going to talk about this at the table, and then what happens is you let rip at your brother, or,
Yes,
you know,
yes,
in a
yes.
way that you like
That's
then,
not controlled, it's
you know,
not
and then you've got a
mindful.
turkey explosion
Yeah.
happening. You know,
Yeah.
so really kind of noticing your emotions, labeling your emotions, choosing what you might let go of and what you might not
really,
let go
like,
of.
thinking about
Like,
it in
actually
advance,
thinking
having
about
a
it.
plan.
And then also, what I talk about in the book is these things called if-then strategies.
Yes, I talked about that in
So
Better Than
yeah,
before.
you know, if this happens, then you know I'm going to
Yeah.
focus on
Yeah.
centering myself in a particular way.
Like you could say, like, if my brother-in-law needles me about what happened, I'm just going to say, well, let's just agree to disagree. You know what I mean? And then it's like, okay, or, you know, have like a thought about how
absolutely.
it's going to go down.
And you get into that space where you just feel not that you're jostling with yourself internally, but that you actually
Have a plan.
Have a space and a plan, but one that's coming out of a centered way of being rather than just reactionary. You know, I'm going to not talk about it, or like I can't stop thinking about it, and so I'm going to, you know, cut everyone off.
Right,
which
right,
a lot of people
right.
are saying.
Well, and then a couple of people may mentioned, like, so Brittany, for example, how do I stop a runaway train of negative emotions when they're spilling out, and I feel like I don't even want to be saying what I'm saying in that emotion, in that moment. So it's like, it's when you're feeling overtaken by, you are hooked. It's just. You can't, and I think we've all had that thing where like you hear yourself saying these mean things or whatever, and you're like, I'm regretting it, and yet I can't resist it.
So Brittany, I'm not sure if this will be accurate for you or not, but sometimes what happens when people have a runaway of negative emotions or of difficult emotions, it's often because they have firstly been trying to push those emotions aside.
So it's a bottling up.
There's often
the dam is bursting.
Yeah, there's often that particular phase is happening, and so part of that is being able to recognize that that's what you're doing. Another aspect of this is that our emotions don't just tend to come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Often what we start having is we start having physiological reactions.
Like
you know,
your heart starts pounding.
Your heart starts pounding.
You feel breathy.
You feel a knot in your stomach.
Yeah.
So those are often precursors to these runaway emotions.
Okay, so you can be attuned to that.
So being centered, being attuned, a lot of people find that the skill of mindfulness is
Yeah.
really helpful because
Right.
it helps you to start, and
Noticing.
I'm not one of these people that think that, you need to put the trash out in a mindful way.
Yeah, yeah.
But there certainly is a skill in being able to notice your emotions before they,
Right, right.
get there. And it's a skill
Right.
that can be cultivated.
Right. And so if you're just joining, I'm talking to Susan David about her book, Emotional Agility, which is really about this thing of like, how do we make sure that because emotions are they're great servants in that they can really help us live the life that we want,
Yeah.
but they're bad masters, and that when we feel overmastered by our
Yeah.
emotions, it's a very, very bad feeling. And if you want to potentially, if you're in the U.S. and Canada and you want to win a copy of the book, answer the question, are you a brooder or a bottler? And I think people really get these terms because we're getting lots and lots of comments
I
about
love
brooding
them.
and bottling. I think this is really striking a chord with people. So, like, Christopher and Michelle are sort of in agreement. Christopher says, I have to divide time equally between families. I have to make sure everyone else is happy before I am myself. Michelle says, I feel the same way, Chris. It's like I'm always being put on the back burner, and my feelings are being hurt, and are not my feelings are not being heard, or my wants and needs met. So, what would you say to people who feel like I'm like everyone is coming before me? Like I have my needs, I have what I want, and somehow other people are just like taking up that space.
So one of the things that I actually talk about in this manifesto that I
yeah.
think is just so important is it says here, appoint yourself the agent of your own life.
Ooh.
And take
Ooh,
ownership of your own development, career,
yes.
creative spirit, work, and connections.
Yes.
I think for all of us, I think so many of us have this struggle, and I, completely empathize with it. Everyone lives their own life, and it's very rare that, or it's unlikely that my 8-year-old son is going to come up to me and say, Mommy, why don't you take a day at the spa? It's unlikely that my in-laws are going to offer to babysit so that I can go, away for a weekend. It's not going to happen.
Right.
So part of our responsibility in this, I think, is about being able to recognize this in ourselves.
Yes.
Recognize that while we can show up to other people, we also need to show up to ourselves. And in some of the research that I've done, what I found, and this is why I talk about these tiny tweaks, is sometimes it's small pockets.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily about changing everything. Sometimes it's about these small pockets that you make for yourself, for your own needs. It could be the audiobook. It could be the once a month,
Right. Or like, I never miss my book club. It's like, I don't care. Like, you guys are on your own. Figure it out.
So it's, I think, firstly, kudos to you to recognize that and to say it and to create a space for yourself.
So that's the first step is to say, I'm feeling this way. I'm feeling like other people are coming before me and no one. So the first thing is just like, that is the feeling that I'm having. Not like I shouldn't feel this way or I'm not feeling that way at all. I'm having this feeling.
There's so much.
And labeling it. I'm feeling neglected. I'm feeling exploited. I'm feeling taken for granted. I'm feeling ignored. I'm feeling like I'm being treated like I'm still 17 years old, even though I'm a grown person. There's a lot of things you could be feeling.
Yeah. And there's so much dignity and grace.
Yeah.
In showing up to that in yourself.
Yes.
And then there's also so much dignity and grace in thinking about, again, thinking about values.
Yeah.
Fairness is something important to me. Yeah. Am I being fair to everyone but not to myself?
Right.
Care is important to me, and this is something that we often see with people who care for others.
Yes.
Is they extending so much care to their other family members that they've forgotten how to extend care to themselves.
Yes.
So thinking about, what is this thing that I can elevate in myself that's really important? And from a tiny tweaks perspective, what does this look like?
Right. What does it actually look like? Not just abstractly, everybody should be more considerate, but like what that would mean, like I get to pick the movie that we're all going to watch. I get to take a nap after breakfast. I get to, or after breakfast, after lunch, or you know what I mean? Like we're going to have my favorite dessert tonight or whatever. So that you feel like your needs, your wants are being entered into the cube along with everybody else's.
Yes. And such an important part of this is other people will not take agency
Yes,
around
no,
this.
I know.
We need to enter into our own space
So
of
this-
agency.
this
It's
is-
critical.
This is the thing with the happiness project that came up, is a lot of times people would be like, well, but I can't get other people in my family to go along with it. And I'm like, okay, like, yeah, don't wait for that. Because it's like, my family didn't go along with it. I mean, you can't expect that everybody's going to be on board and that everybody's, and you see that with habits and Better Than Before. Like, a lot of times people think, well, I need everybody else's support. Well, sometimes people aren't supportive. Either they don't care, or it's like slightly inconvenient for them. They would rather have their own favorite dessert, so they don't want you to take your turn. It's working for them the way that it is. And so sometimes you have to acknowledge, like, not everybody is going to be 100% supportive.
Yeah.
And they might be just ignoring it, or they might actually be obstructionist. And sometimes that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and the other true aspect of this is that we have so much more insight into our own internal world.
Yes.
And so there's this wonderful research that shows that, you know, because we know that we care and because we know that we worry about other people's dessert, we tend to, you know, so we start creating these assumptions of, like, because I know this, the other person should know it.
Yes.
And sometimes we've got to let go of that. I mean, it's difficult. I think all of us experience this, but it's such an important, take agency of your life, show up to that feeling with yourself, recognizing the grace and dignity that it extols within you. And then think about what are some small actions that are congruent. And concrete. Yeah. Well, I want to put a link in the comments to one of my favorite posts that I ever wrote, which is about the problems of shared work, which is like all the problems that arise when people are supposed to do shared work. And one of the problems that comes up with shared work is that people tend to do things they value. So, like, I send out holiday cards, and my husband gets the air conditioning fixed because I don't really care about air conditioning because I'm cold all the time, and he doesn't. I mean, he likes holiday cards, but he's not going to lift a finger. But you sort of have to say, like, well, just because I want the garage to be clean. Doesn't mean that somebody else thinks it's an important thing to do. And if they don't think it's important to do, they probably aren't going to be very cooperative. And so part of it is saying, like, well, maybe something's important to me, but it's not important to you. Or, you know, I feel like, oh, I'm doing all this, and you don't even think of, you know, people, I get so many comments from people who are like, I volunteered graciously for 3 months to do this task, and no one has said a word of appreciation or taken their turn. And then when they go to the people are like, I thought that was part of your job description. Like, I thought your job was to sort the mail, or I thought that was like, you know, it's like, they're like, I didn't know that was like special favor. Like, so they just don't know. They literally don't know what your psychic process is. And they're not trying to be mean. They're not trying to, they're just not paying much
attention. Yeah. No, so Claire says, this is interesting. I'm extremely open and honest, or raw and real. It feels as though this is my purpose in life, to demonstrate that it builds connection when you share how you feel in a courageous way, as long as it's in a safe space to do so. The more I look after me, the better I feel, and in turn those around me are now feeling themselves better and respecting my boundaries. That sounds incredibly mature. Oh my gosh. Wow. Gold star. Yes. Thumbs up. Gold star to Claire. And that sounds like exactly the kind of thing.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I think it's just
being
so
able
important.
to do that.
Yeah.
And so, what about, like, what is, if you could say, like, that there's, like, one common problem. I mean, I'm sure people are constantly, like, sort of saying to you, like, what about this scenario? What about that scenario? Is there, like, one or two things where you're like, something that comes up, it's like, I'm a parent and I want to help my children, or like, what are the questions that, like, you're going around
parenting is the parenting one is huge.
Because I know you've been talking all around the country, so this is something that people...
Yes. So in Emotional Agility, I lay out this process of emotional agility, and then I apply it in two ways. I talk about it in relationships in general, and there's specifically a chapter on parenting, and then I also talk about these concepts applied to work. So it's very, broad across different contexts. But
we have emotions everywhere.
We have emotions everywhere, isn't it? Yeah. So, I wrote an article, or actually I was interviewed for an article for the New York Times.
Well, it was like the #1 most emailed article of the week, right?
It outdid the vice presidential elections, which was...
Oh my gosh. Wait, so what's the title of it? We'll put a link to it in the comments.
So it was a New York Times article, and it was called Teaching Your Child Emotional Agility.
Okay. So
this comes up for a lot of people, people saying, how do these skills apply to children?
Right.
So not to be a Debbie Downer here, but when you look at the data, what is fascinating is that the World Health Organization predicts that by 2030, depression, not heart disease, not cancer, not diabetes, depression will be the leading cause of disability globally.
Wow.
Which is just, and as a psychologist, so I'm at Harvard Medical School, we're seeing increases in suicide in 5 and 6-year-old children. We are seeing dramatic increases in anxiety, in depression, and so on. And so one of the things that I talk about in this article is this really, really important skill set that as children, kids need to develop. And that is the ability to navigate all emotions. Not just feel happy and be happy and that's okay, but it's only when children get practice around, this is what sadness feels like. This is what anger feels like. This is when they develop that sense of practice, they become competent with the emotion. They don't have this feeling that the emotion is bigger than they are. They develop strategies and so on.
Do you ever feel like, just to interrupt, do you ever feel like sometimes adults try to almost self-medicate with children? Like they need children to be like bright and bubbly and enthusiastic, and it's almost like they need them to serve that role. And then if the child isn't feeling bright and bubbly, or is like scared of a clown, or scared to go to school, or annoyed with the music class, it's like the adult, it feels like that's totally unacceptable. I feel like sometimes I see people where it's like a child is supposed to be childlike, which we associate with being like full of enthusiasm and fun. Well, if you spend any time with a little kid, they aren't totally.
They aren't, and they shouldn't be.
No,
they shouldn't be.
Right. So
I am not, as I say, I'm not the paragon of excellence with this. I describe in Emotional Agility this just fascinating experience of when my child was just a couple of weeks old, taking him to the doctor for his shots. And it was, he had been cocooned and loved and was goo-goo and godly, and we go off to the doctor, and it's this bizarre thing because here the mother or the parent hands the baby over to be hurt, basically.
I literally got vaccines today, and there was a baby. Like, you could tell, like there's this like, I can't believe you did this to me. I know. I was just like, I have to cover my ears.
It was that kind of experience. And my child had never cried before. He had never yet produced tears. And so I had this experience of handing him over and him getting the shots. And his face went from smiley into outrage, like red beetroot red. And I, with the best of intentions, because when we parent in this way, we do it always with good intentions, picked him up and said, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. And he was crying and crying, and I was saying, it's okay, it's okay. And the nurse, so compassionately, so kindly, looked up from what she was doing and said to me, it's not okay. It will be okay, but it's not okay. And I realized that in that moment, what I was doing, imagine we were upset and someone comes to us and says, it's okay. No,
right. Then you're just like, do you not understand what's happening here? Yeah.
And so what she was saying to me was, this child is feeling scared.
So you say, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts.
This child is feeling scared. So she said to me, it will be okay, but it's not okay now. And I realized that even with the best of intentions, and I wrote about this in the article, that what we sometimes do is our child comes home from school and says, Mommy, no one would play with me. Or Daddy, no one would play with me. And our heart breaks because we didn't want our child to experience that. So what do? We jump in and try to make things right. What I call emotional helicoptering. This emotional helicoptering. And then what happens is we try to solve the situation for the child. In it, we often, without intending to, have invalidated the experience, taken away their opportunity to label their emotion, taken away the opportunity to problem solve. So what was funny in this situation is I was like, I've got a Ph.D. in this stuff, So I started to brood, and my husband came home from work, and I said to him, you'll never believe what happened today. Noah got his shots and he was crying, and I said, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. And my husband looked at me completely quiet, bemused. He's very funny, and I raged on for like 20 minutes. And then he said to me, it's okay, Susan.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
It's okay.
Like to be funny or
to be funny? He's just really funny. He's really funny. But what I talk about in the book is this idea that even at a very young age, children, at age 2 and 3, children can start differentiating between their different emotions. So when you're reading a story to a child and you say to the child, is this person angry or sad or lonely?
Oh, yeah.
This is how we start developing this
vocabulary. Oh, interesting.
So that's one aspect.
Oh, like the lonely doll. Like, what is the lonely
What
doll
does
feeling?
that
She's lonely.
feel
Yeah,
like?
yeah.
Another aspect of this in households is sometimes what we do is we inadvertently message that some emotions are okay or not okay. So these are called display rules. We grow up in a family that says when you're angry, go to your room and come up with a smile on your face. Or happiness is only okay here.
Oh, right. Or like Learning Goes Wilder. It's like 8-year-olds don't cry.
Yeah. And so what we are teaching then is that some emotions are to be feared. Some emotions are okay. Some emotions aren't okay. So one of the critical aspects of cultivating emotional agility in children is that all emotions are okay. Emotions are human evolutionary signals.
Right. They're just,
they are normal.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that because my son is frustrated with his baby sister that he gets to act on his emotions and give her away at the shopping center. But that emotion in of itself is okay. So a few things, showing up to your child's emotions, an openness to the emotions, stepping out, helping your child to label emotions, walking your why, helping the child to think about how do I want to be in this situation where I'm feeling rejected or where I'm feeling scared to do this. Like, what is it that's important to me here? Moving on, or these tiny tweaks, what are some small things that I could do? You don't need to make friends with every single child in a new school at once. Who are one or two potential people that you could start connecting with? So these ideas apply absolutely to children.
Wait, so if you're just joining, I'm talking to Susan David and her book Emotional Agility, which is fascinating. And if you're in the U.S. and Canada and you want an opportunity to get a free copy, answer the question: are you a brooder or a bottler when it comes to emotion? Which seems to be terms that have come up. Okay, but so now I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I've got you right here, and I'm going to ask you for some advice. Okay. So I'm sitting here thinking like, I don't know that I'm handling this properly, so I'm going to ask you. Okay. So I have a 17-year-old daughter, Eliza, who is a senior in high school, and so she's applying to college. And that often means that like we have to have uncomfortable conversations, like, well, if you're going to do it, you have to like write this like really like you have to spend your weekend writing this essay, and you know even though you don't have like maybe you're done with your homework, but you have to do this essay, or like you really have to like make this list, and it's very upsetting, like it's very emotionally charged for the children and everything, and so a lot of times I'm kind of in the position of being the bearer of bad news, like saying, you really need to work on that draft of that essay, or you really need to study for your standardized tests, and what I find is that often like we'll have an uncomfortable situation, and it's not terrible. It's not like we're screaming and yelling. It's just it's uncomfortable, and my daughter's kind of annoyed. Not even so much annoyed with me, but just sort of annoyed with the situation. But I definitely am in the position of being the bearer of bad news, and I feel like I'm the whip cracker, saying like you got to do it, and like like are you gonna you can't see your friends this afternoon because you've got to work. And then I feel like, so a lot of times we'll do that, then we'll sort of have a break, and then I'll come back like 10 or 15 minutes later, and like I'll want her to comfort me, like that we're in harmony. That's our family vocabulary. It's like, are we in harmony? Like my husband and I often talk about that. Are we in harmony means like, okay, we had this fight, like are we in harmony? Okay? Are we in harmony now? And so, which is good. But I wonder if sometimes in my desire to have harmony and like give her a hug and am I making her comfort me? Or am I somehow like saying like you're allowed to feel mad but only for 10 minutes? Or is this a good thing where it's showing like I understand that you feel bad and I just want to like show that I still love you? Like is this a good thing or a bad thing in terms of like it almost I'm kind of wondering if it's a bad thing because it feels a little bit needy. It doesn't feel like it's coming from a mature place. It feels like it's coming from I need you to like give me a hug and tell me that it's okay that I just was nagging you.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think a really important aspect here, not to psychoanalyze here, but I think a really important aspect is, it sounds, especially for a 17-year-old, autonomy is so important.
Yes.
And so as much as you can, giving choices rather than directions is critical.
Yeah.
So I think that's just really important, and I actually talk about this in my book in different ways. Like, what does this look like?
What does that look like? Yeah,
but it does actually sound like it's you who has the need to be comforted.
Yeah, she's like, well, oh man, like I don't want to do it. You know what I mean? Yeah,
So,
yeah. And I'm like,
like, are we still okay?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds to me like you have this sense of concern that you feel like you're being put in this position, or like someone's put you in the position, and now, and that it's actually coming from.
But maybe
your
that's
sense.
that's the sign. Maybe that's the sign that I'm hooked. Is that I feel like It feels needy. It feels like it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm in it. Like it feels like it's coming from a place not of like mindful and purposeful.
Yeah.
It feels needy. It feels.
And then the other thing
Okay.
that I would say to this last,
Okay, good. I asked. I mean, what are we going to do?
The other thing that I'd say is if you can help her to surface her own values and her own want to in the situation. And maybe she's done it already. That's an incredible motivator. So when someone keeps saying to you, like, you've got to study, you've got to this, you've got to, it can feel ultimately like a prison around us.
Yeah.
And then the person starts to rebel or, feel rebellious or even just feel resentful. Mm-hmm. But if we can start to elevate what is it that's like really important to you here? Or there was this fascinating study that was done on exactly this, looking at kids who were studying for exams, okay? And when they were told that they had to study because they had to, pass, or because they had to do well, or because they had particular standards that they needed to get to, the children were more resentful, were likely to slack off more, and so on. When the conversation was elevated to what would passing this exam mean for you in your future career, or how would this help you with being a doctor?
See, this is the interesting thing where I really analyze that kind of thing very much through my own four tendencies, which I made up and whatever. Take it for what it's worth, because I feel like something else is actually going on there. Yeah. It's not. I wouldn't interpret that the way I wouldn't give it that interpretation. I would be saying that, like, for the questioners, they've had a question answered in a way that is now satisfying to them that wasn't satisfying before. Yes. But like for an obliger, if you said, I think you should learn this, but I'm not going to give you a test, then they wouldn't do it. They need anyway, so it's like my own psychic thing. Anyway, the four tendencies. I'm writing my book. Yes, this is her book. My book about the four tendencies will get into that. There's actually
good synergy, but we'll talk about it another time.
Yeah. But it's interesting. But again, that's an interesting thing where it's like, there's so many ways to interpret what's going on. And it's like, back to your point that you made a while back about emotions, it's like, you might feel like this is the emotional truth of this, but it might not be somebody else's emotional truth. It's like, you've got your own psychic landscape, and you assume everybody sees the same thing you do. And it's like, it's only when you permit that space to open up that you see, this is just me. This is what I'm experiencing.
So, piece of advice then.
Yeah, oh, good. Excellent, good. Okay, I've got my pen.
No. I mean, maybe you've done this, but if you're starting to feel resentful that you're nagging your daughter, and even resentful of yourself, feeling like you've been put in that position, is say that to her. Like, how could we come to a space? I'm feeling like I'm nagging you and pushing you away, whereas it's not my intention. Yeah. How can we, like, what is a better way for us to be doing this and involve her in solving it?
But one of the things that's, and maybe we don't want to keep getting into this, but one of the things that's interesting as a side note is I feel like there is this, and this is a very hard thing to manage, because again, and I think it's children and adults, that sometimes you do feel like you're nagging and you feel like you're being controlling and there's resentment. But then sometimes it's like you're actually like that, like saying to somebody like, well, let's make a list, or let's make a timeline, like, is actually a huge relief to them that somebody else is sort of going to help them walk through it. And so I feel like sometimes the emotion is also like, to your point of like, what's the value being served here? Or like, how are we doing this together? It's like, is this okay? If we pull out a legal pad and start doing this, does this make you feel better? Do we feel more constructive? Or are you starting to feel resentful and angry at me and like you're rolling your eyes? Yeah. It's like the fact that I've got a yellow pad doesn't mean I'm being constructive or nagging. It's like, what is the emotional reality?
The intention?
But a lot of times, it's like, back to your point about being right. You're like, I am being constructive. Don't you see my legal pad? And it's like, your legal pad is what makes me want to like strangle you.
Yes.
Yes. And so
I
it
love
is. It's this. That's why I think the title of your book, Emotional Agility, is so brilliant, because it's like, it's just this idea of being able to, like have the flexibility to deal with like something that's changing
Yes,
constantly.
it's the context.
It's
It's
not
being
a
able to be
relationship.
context, yeah.
I mean, there isn't there's no template. There's no
Yes.
one size fits all, because it's in motion all the time.
That is just so important. Is, you know, if a manager's dealing with a difficult situation at work, or
Yes.
someone's dealing, often people say, "What should I do?"
Yes,
But it's like,
yes.
it
You must get
depends
that
on-
all the time. Like you get like a 5-sentence email. Therefore, what should I do? And you're like,
But it depends on the
Yeah.
context. And so what
Yes.
we need is we need our internal skills to help us to navigate that context, which is why I wrote the book.
yeah. Well,
So-
I have monopolized you
No,
for so
no,
long.
no,
So
it's
again, the book is called Emotional Agility. I know that you're seeing it backwards, but it's a brilliant book about how to get unstuck, embrace change, and thrive in work and life, which basically that's what everybody wants all the time. So, and if you want to take Susan's very short but extremely telling quiz, where you can find out a lot about yourself from taking a short quiz, we will put that link in the comments so you can look at that there. And I want to mention again, I'll put the link to what was your most emailed, how to help children.
Oh, so a couple of the most emailed around children was called
it was the
Teaching
New-
Your Child Emotional
It was the New
Agility,
York
which
Times,
was
in
New York Times.
yeah, which is like a great piece. So we'll put a link to that, because that clearly was striking a nerve with people. If it's most emailed. And Emotional Agility was selected by Amazon editors as one of the best leadership and business books of 2016. And didn't it make some other list too?
Yeah, it's been doing well.
It's
been
making the rounds of all the lists.
It's been good.
And it's really getting. I think it's really getting a lot of buzz, because I think it's clear too that I think more and more people are realistically understanding that, like, achieving your goals, getting success, it isn't enough just to like get the straight A's on your report card or like to take the right software class. That so much of it is self-management, understanding other people, empathy, like being flexible in like when there's ambiguity or uncertainty, and like how do you bring your values with you wherever you go. And so the next live broadcast will be here at 10 o'clock, back to my new normal time of 3 p.m. Eastern. And as always, we'll talk about stuff from the podcast or anything else anybody wants to talk about. Almost got to. And but so again, thank you so much to Susan David. I feel like we could talk all day. Yes. So anyway, thanks very much for joining us. Onward and upward.